Hi, everybody. My name is Michael Rogers, and welcome to this month's edition of Go Ahead and Ask, where we talk with Pastor Bruce Mulder about all kinds of things that may be on your mind about your Christian faith and Presbyterianism specifically. Bruce, welcome back.
Thanks,
Always
Michael.
Good to see you.
Good to be here.
We've got a list of good questions this month. And let's talk first about Lent.
Okay.
I want to know where it is in the Bible that every church has to host a Friday fish fry during Lent.
It's not in the Bible.
Okay.
Lent, Ash Wednesday, which kicks off when? Begins the season of Lent. I'm not sure when it was instituted, but it was instituted by the church basically because the people were forgetting. They were forgetting the story of God's rescue, just as God's people in the previous testament were forgetting about God's rescuing them from Egypt. People were becoming lackadaisical and forgetting that Jesus had died for us. And so I don't know the exact history of it. So this season of Lent was established as a time for the church and its people to focus on the cost of who Jesus is, what Jesus did, on the gift of repentance, etc.
So the purpose is not to feast on fried fish on Fridays necessarily, but prepare us for the Easter celebration.
Right. It's a preparation for Holy Week. Just like Advent is a preparation for Christmas, you can think of Lent as a preparation for Holy Week, from, for the Palm and Passion Sunday through Holy Week, through Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, and of course, Easter Sunday when Jesus is raised from the dead. Yeah.
When I was a kid being raised in the Catholic faith, we'd be encouraged to give something up for Lent. Mm-hmm. So being smart alecky kids, we all said, yeah, I'm going to give up smoking. And we thought of things that we weren't going to do anyway. And we said, all right, we're giving that up for Lent. But what's the purpose of that tradition as well?
As I understand it, and I am by no means an expert on this, is you're making a sacrifice. And that sacrifice is, I think, supposed to help you remember and understand the sacrifice that Jesus makes on the cross. So the idea, I think, is one is supposed to give up something that has meaning or value to them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's my understanding.
Okay. Let me shift gears away from Lent. Unless there's something else you want to add about Lenten observance.
I gave up bubble gum once when I was in 7th grade, which was huge because I chewed it all the time. I still do.
Yeah, okay. I want to maybe ask you to expand a little bit about some remarks you made in your sermon this morning about the story of Job and doing away with retributive justice. Can you expand on that a little bit? What is the meaning? How do we get that out of the story of Job?
So retributive justice is a theological word. It basically means for any effect, there's a cause. So if someone of faith is suffering, you have to have done something to have brought this upon yourself. It simply cannot be. Something had to have happened, and usually you did something that was wrong or contrary to the will of God or contrary to God. So this idea, retributive justice, tit for tat. You do this, you get this, big surprise. And that's what Job's friends are accusing him of. They're saying, you brought this upon yourself, you sinned against God, but they don't know the joke is on them, because we who have already read the story know at the very beginning in the first 2 chapters that Job is suffering because God and a character named Satan, not the Satan who we think of associated with the devil, but Satan have made this wager. Not one time, but a couple of times, and God has said, okay, I'm in. Do what you have to do, just spare Job's life. And so Job has brought none of this upon himself. So in that case, and the rest of the story is, Job continually asking, why is this happening? I would like to talk to God. He finally gets his wish and realizes that, if you're going to speak to the creator of heaven and earth, you might be in a little over your head, which he realizes. And then the end of the story is God never gives him an explanation. God says, I'll restore you, but never an explanation. So I take away from that. We ask, it's normal, it's human. I want to know why. If I don't get an explanation, I think what Job is saying, I want to know why, and God says, I'm with you. And then Job, at the end, repents, which is not the same as confessing his sin. It means he's withdrawing his complaint. Okay, I've said things I shouldn't have said, something to that effect, so I'm withdrawing my complaint. And then God restores him, although the kicker in this is, well, okay, he got a new family and knew this and knew that, but what about his original one? So there's a lot to struggle with in this book. It's a great story.
And the story resonates here 2,000-3,000 years later whenever there's a natural disaster or personal
absolutely,
misfortune.
yeah. Why'd this happen? Yeah.
Why me? And you want to find somebody to blame.
Right. Or just an explanation. Why does this keep happening to, this congregation or this person or this group of people? What are they doing wrong? Oh.
I finished reading the new book by Ross Douthat, the columnist for the New York Times, and he's a devout Catholic and considered a leading Christian intellectual. And he does say that Christianity, it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to demand, God, tell me why is it things work this way?
Absolutely.
And the question of misfortune, natural disasters, the global question of why is there evil, we don't get a satisfactory answer. At least now, maybe someday, maybe after we die, God will sit us down and say, hey, this is why. And we'll say, of course.
Of course.
Yeah.
Or maybe we'll just be so thrilled to be in the kingdom that it won't matter. I don't know. Yeah, it'd be nice to have answers.
Right. And that's human for us to want.
Yeah, it's like A Few Good Men. You want answers, you want the truth, you can't handle the truth. It's kind of like that.
Yes, very true. But it did really resonate with me when you talked about retributive justice, because we do see that today with responses to natural disasters, to wars, everything. And at this point,
sadly, it's many times it's Christians who are saying it's because they did this. They brought it upon themselves.
Right.
And that is something I really am disgusted by.
Right. And the flip side of that is if you are fortunate in life, it's because of your holiness or something.
Right.
Yeah, that led you to be blessed by God.
Right.
And maybe it's just luck.
And that was the mindset, in the story of Job. The mindset is if you're righteous and do all these things, well, God will reward you. And it doesn't happen. And in the Old Testament, there are always these questions of not about why do bad things happen to good people. The question is, why do wicked people still live and why do they thrive? Mm-hmm. You look around, you see these people are evil. Why are they still alive? Why do they thrive? Why are they doing so well? They dishonor God, and yet they continue to walk the earth, and they're successful or rich or have roles of influence or importance. It's a better question in a way.
And a corollary of that is, if it's clear and obvious that evil things will happen to evil people, good things happen to good people, then what happens to free will? I mean, if it's...
Yeah, that's tough. I don't know the answer to that. These are great questions, and this is why you need to have community and why it's good to ask questions, because the Bible is not fixed it's not fixed, it's the living word, so we interact with it.
Well, we bring these great questions because we get great answers, if not total, complete, satisfying answers, at least insights to help us think more deeply about these quandaries.
I hope so.
All right, a couple questions from our viewers. If so much of the Bible, in both the Old and the New Testament, is written in parables and metaphors, so Bruce, you have a way of unlocking these through your sermons, but is there a translation somewhere that would help me understand more of the Bible?
It's not so much a translation, but if you're familiar with Eugene Peterson's The Message, that's a paraphrase of the Bible. And he wrote the New Testament part of the Message maybe 30 years ago. And Eugene Peterson was a very good preacher, author, scholar. So he knew what he was doing when he was translating the original text, but then putting it into everyday language, everyday English. Some of it will sound a little bit dated because it is 30 years old and idioms and phrases change, but it can be helpful if you're reading something, whether it's a parable or something else in one of the letters, and you're like, I have no idea what that means. You can read how Peterson paraphrases it, and maybe that'll help you kind of get the gist of it. It may not explain it satisfactorily, and that's okay, but it'll help you like, oh, I kind of get what's going at. But really what it takes is more, just like anything else, repetition, 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 because you can read the same story 1,000 times and you might come away with 418 different ways of hearing it.
It's confusing for us lay people when we read about controversies and discussions about the precise meaning of a particular word, whether from the ancient Aramaic,
Hebrew, yeah.
Right.
Or Greek, yeah.
Yeah, and then
that's a whole, I'm not an expert in this, but that's a whole other field of translation. When you're translating from one language to another and then to another based upon the one that you translated from originally, it loses nuance, right? What was it? Some scholar once said that all translators are thieves, and not in a negative sense, but that they're attempting their best to not only get the word, but the nuance and the context and the continuity and the community, that all of that a word has, because it's so difficult.
An addendum from our viewer who sent that question. He says, if all the commands in the Bible are to be followed, I doubt that there's many people in heaven. but we don't know.
Yeah, Jesus, thankfully, when he is asked, what are the greatest commandments? There were either 613 or 623, if my memory serves. And Jesus whittles it down to 2. Love God, love your neighbors yourself. And if you do those things, everything else kind of falls into place, if you will. And he says, that's the summary of the law. And he says, I'm not here to do away with the law. I'm not wiping it off the boards. I'm fulfilling it. I'm bringing it to its fulfillment, which is to love God and neighbor and self.
Returning to this idea of the interpretation of ancient Aramaic and the meaning of the Bible and so forth, I'll return to the book by Ross Douth that I should actually bring a copy and show it next time, show it up on the camera, because it's a terrific book. And he notes in one chapter that recent biblical scholarship is finding, rather than refuting the Bible, is finding much more factual basis, and especially good historic record and justification for believing that the life of Jesus was real. Far more mention in contemporaneous records, the records of the Romans. We know much more and can feel much more confident about it than we can about stories of ancient Greece or even the Romans, who kept very good records. And I found that particularly interesting, because there is, now in Ross's book he says that the great age of the vocal atheist, he thinks it's past its prime, it's past its peak. And the theme of his entire book is that if you look at the entirety of reasons to be Christian, it makes much more sense than not being Christian. It takes a specific desire not to be religious to doubt the evidence before our very eyes.
Yeah. Either Kierkegaard, or who I've never read, or who's the other guy? Blaise Pascal has this basic theorem. It's, for lack of better, this is the vernacular, better to believe that God does exist and be proved wrong than the opposite. Something to that effect. But this is the same idea, I forget if that was Kierkegaard or Pascal. Maybe it was someone different.
Yeah. And for our viewers who, as we all do, have doubts or maybe are just approaching the idea of the Christian faith, Ross says, take this seriously, start somewhere. If you're a non-believer, start reading, investigating.
Yeah.
And you don't have time to put it off. You got time for pickleball lessons, you can do this and that, then you can take time to attend services and read religious books and learn more about this.
And when you read scripture, poke at it, ask it questions. People have been doing that for hundreds of years. They can take it.
Yep. And the final thing I'll say about Ross's book, because we need to kind of wrap up for this month, is that he says the whole story of Jesus' life is so weird that it's got to be true. You couldn't make this stuff up.
Right. That's
And
what, yeah.
if you wanted to make it up, you would have made up something much more internally consistent. But he points out that the Bible, written by different people who sometimes contradict each other, which is what you would expect from eyewitnesses or people who had talked to the eyewitnesses. They all have different perspectives on that. If it were fake or written to convince people in a different way, it would have read like a novel and
Right.
all made perfect sense.
Right.
But it doesn't all make perfect sense.
And that's one of the things the early church had, especially to figure out how to communicate, because they admitted that Jesus was crucified, but they had to figure out a way to explain, not justify, but explain that our Messiah was crucified, because the cross in that era was a symbol of shame, among other things. And this is why Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. But the church had to say, how do we make sense of this so that people, because people were saying, wait, your God was crucified? That's kooky. You believe he's, so the church had to, and Paul does this in 1 Corinthians and whatnot, but even for the first few centuries, the church had to figure out ways to talk about this and to make sense of it so that people who didn't understand or just said it's downright rubbish, at least you could not convince them, but just have some sort of coherent conversation and say, here's why we believe,
We've had another great discussion this month, Bruce, but it's time to wrap up. Is there anything else you want to add as we conclude this month?
Nope, I'm good, thank you.
Okay. Well, we'll see you again. I think we'll record, trying to remember exactly what day Easter falls on, but we may record.
Yeah, April 20th, I believe.
Okay, we'll probably do another show before that. But thanks again for taking time to help answer my questions and questions from our viewers. And thanks to all of you for watching. Please feel free to share this with your friends and neighbors and give us a like on YouTube and Facebook and wherever. And we appreciate your attendance and viewership and your attention to our messages of hope. With that, we're concluded. My name is Michael Rogers. We'll see you next time.